So as we're looking at criteria around data classification, you first thing you need to do is identify a specific owner for the data. And this comes down to an individual who is ultimately responsible for the data and the protection of it. Now, you could have two different people. You could have the person who is the owner of the data, and he or she may not be the person that is actually overall responsible for securing the information. But when it comes down to define who has the actual data, that is the person that needs to deal with it. You also need to determine how the data will be classified and labeled. So when it comes down to labeling the information, what would you do around that? How do you protect that information? And so that would be from a classified situation to an unclassified situation. It could be a situation where you have top secret and secret. You have higher than secret or higher than top secret. Those are different pieces as the military is related to data classification. But one thing you may have from a business point of view is you may have intellectual property, and you may call that as low, medium, or high, or potentially even critical, depending upon the situation of your company. Something to keep in mind, though, is the fact that the more labels that you put in here, the higher classifications, the different tiers, the more complex and the more challenging it will be to manage long term. So you need to consider that before you end up putting all these labels in place. So you also need to classify the appropriate data. Now, a partial classification program is better than nothing. And so putting in place something that would say, you know what, we've got it set up for just high, medium, and low. That would be great. Your high aspects are going to have a certain protection in place. A medium is a certain level, and a low is basically, you could say it's not protected at all. But you have to come up with something. And even if you went with high and low, that is a great option to start with. The key, though, is keeping your high very small and succinct. Do not get overcomplicated with the numbers that you put in there from a high, medium, and low standpoint, just because the simple fact of the matter is if you make all these different tiers, again, like I talked about previously, it will be a bit of a challenge to manage and maintain. You also need to consider some level of an exemption process, and this process would be put in place because you're going to have issues that are going to come up. You're going to have people that are going to struggle with something they're going to need to have an exemption with, and so you're going to have something in place to manage those exemptions. You also need to determine a security controls to be used. So this comes into where you have your high, and let's just say, for example, we're going to go with low and high. And you have already determined the exception process. You already know who the owner is. You know, in the case of someone has a high IP that you need to have protected, or a high data, whether it's like PII or financial data or something along those lines, then what you're going to have to decide is, do you have the right controls in place? So for an example, you might want to say, we have put in place access controls for the high IP or the high information. Along with that, we have put in a level of encryption on the data itself, so that's protected. So that's another barrier. Along with that, you have added the access to it is reduced because of access controls physically from getting into the building. You can't get into the building anymore, or you have only certain ways you can get in the building. You may have it set up where if you are going to access specific high information, remote access is not allowed. So you can have these different controls in place to help reduce that. You also need to determine procedures to declassify this information, right? So say, for instance, you have your high IP, or you have your highly classified information that's set up in this space. How do you declassify that? How do you take off that level of protection for that information? And so that could also come down to is that who is the right owner? So is it a process in place where the owner can then send a link to somebody that's saying, yes, I approve this, or does it have to have a second party involved to remove the protections? In many cases, like I've seen in the past, what will happen is the individual who owns the data will say, okay, we need to remove this information from there. And then an email is sent to maybe a head, like a VP, or maybe even the CEO, depending upon the size of the company, saying that I am going to remove the protections from this data. Then the CEO or that next level person then allows that to occur. Once that happens, then that is let to IT, and then IT then takes the protections off. Now, you can have it set up where it's real streamlined, where it's just the individual. I'd highly recommend against having just one person who can remove and add the protections at a whim. The reason is that if that person ever becomes compromised, or if that account that the person uses becomes compromised, then they could end up turning around and turning off the protections on your information, and then it can be sent wherever you want. So I would avoid that if all possible. It's also important to have some level of enterprise awareness around what you're trying to accomplish. So you need to talk to individuals within your company that are going to be managing your intellectual property, and what should they do to deal with it? How do they manage the IP, and also what are the procedures basically from how do they begin the intellectual property or the classification process? How do they transfer the information? What are the exemption processes, and what is the destruction process? All of those key aspects need to be created from beginning to end, and you need to teach people how this works. Just basically because if you don't do that, what's going to happen is they're going to go out and make all kinds of crazy changes to your environment, and it will affect your overall protection of your IP. Tagging. So here's an effective metadata strategy that you can utilize for your company as well. You can basically add metadata to your IP or to your data. And this, from a data classification standpoint, you can also search on this metadata. You may, in many cases, not expose the actual sensitive information by using this metadata. The challenge of it is, though, is that it can contain some very sensitive information. So if you use it, just know and keep in mind that if you're exposing this information to the outside world, there could be sensitive information which would give somebody the data that they might want to do broader searches within your environment. As an example, in a previous life, what we would do is I would search for metadata, and I'd find out metadata had this super secret sauce that was there. And it would say it didn't have the super secret sauce in the metadata itself, but it told me the file names that were associated with the super secret sauce. Say that sentence 3 times. If you do that, then what ends up happening is now as an attacker gets within your environment, they now can use those keywords off of that metadata to search within your environment, which so could add some level of risk. So you got to think about that and determine, is that a valuable option to continue? And if it is, then obviously use a metadata strategy. But I would recommend you utilize some level of metadata. You just need to define how much of that information do you want to maintain within your data structure and with your data classification environment. Now there's 2 types. There's a structured and unstructured data. Now, 80% of your data is most likely considered unstructured. And that's just basically hanging out there, right? That's data that's always used, and that most of that data would be considered unstructured. Now, if business has little idea that it exists, it probably doesn't even know that it exists. It is just data that's created by your people when they're doing their daily activities. But it's not in a structured high or low IP type of solution or high or low data classification standpoint. Now, what was an interesting concept I thought was Forrester Research had out there there's about 100 million documents each and every day that are created from people just creating stuff. So out of the world, 100 million documents are created every day. So if you think about that, that is just, can't even comprehend how much information is put out about these individual companies. And in many cases, there is some sensitive information that's within these documents on a daily basis. So having a good data classification process in place is extremely important, but you need to do it from the beginning and also incorporate these various tools. So you understand what your data is, right? So what is most important? You have controls in place on your data. You've defined what the classification scheme is. You implement these controls on your data classification scheme. You utilize metadata to help make it searchable, but you have a good plan around your metadata. And then you also are focused on only the structured data. The unstructured data you're not, because it's just too much. So the point of that, though, is by educating, which we had talked about earlier, is that by educating your employees, you now can get into a good strategy around protecting this information. Otherwise, what's going to happen is you'll say, and you have to educate them to go, okay, this is intellectual property. This is highly sensitive information. This is information that is dealing with personnel. You need to protect it in this manner. If you don't do that, what's going to happen? You're going to have all kinds of data sprawl, and it's going to go everywhere. Now, there's vast quantities of business data formats. That's the other issue that you're going to run into. from intellectual property type stuff to AutoCAD to medical files to financial records, you name it, it's all out there. And now, especially as you get into having employee data within an ERP solution, which is like your enterprise resource planning solution, SAP, there's other companies out there that have similar options to it. But basically, it's what it comes down to is all of your information is stored within these solutions. Well, as they're stored within these solutions, one, they have gobs and gobs of data about your company, about your employees, and are a very lucrative target for hackers. And so, therefore, what ends up happening is many people lose sight of the fact that they have this data maybe protected in these certain individual spots, but when it goes into these ERP solutions, they don't have the information protected. So this is something to consider as you're dealing with around tagging. Now, lifecycle management. Now, information lifecycle management is that you need to really take a tiered approach as you're approaching this. And the reason I ask that is, I say that is because you're going to have a situation where there's going to be information is less important in a certain location than in another location. But I would recommend that you store this information in one location or in a structured plan around where you store this information. And now some people will take the attitude that, well, if I put all my highest IP or my most sensitive information in one location, it'll make it much simpler for an attacker or a hacker to get access to this information rather than having it, if it's spread around, then they can't find all this information. That's true in the fact that it's now in one central spot and it's easier for a hacker to potentially get. However, it's also easier for you to protect, monitor, and watch. If you're not doing that, what ends up happening is your data can get all spread everywhere. You don't even know where it's at. And if you don't know where it's at, then it's really hard to protect something where you don't know where it lives. So it's imperative that you put together some level of a tiered approach and is storing this data in in one specific location. And so therefore, it also you get able to watch and monitor who can control and access this information. So only specific information might be available to individuals, and now it's in one specific spot. So now I can go, if I have a security capability set up within my company, and it's looking at that one SharePoint site, for example, and that's where all my personal data is stored, I now can watch what comes and goes out of that data. Is there information that's put out there? Is it available for people to consume on a readily basis? But also when people are consuming it, are they able to take this information and can I track where's it going and how's it getting there? So these are really important aspects that you need to consider as you're looking at different tiered locations. So again, my recommendation is that you store this in one central location if you can. If you can't put it in one central location, then consider some key aspects or some key points where you would store this information. So say in Asia, you have it in one location. In the Americas, you have it in another location. In Europe, you have it in another location. So you have those stored in three basically choke points, but you can then at least watch and monitor those choke points for any suspicious or unusual activity. You need to categorize it based on criticality. Now, it's important that the data be moved to a lesser costing solution. So like in some cases where you have data that is unstructured, it's not important, you've already categorized this information and said that it's not important, is moving it to basically a less important or off of in a location that's not as protected will save you money. If you start whittling down the information instead of having it in multiple locations, you now have all this data that's unstructured in a certain location. You can then cut back on the cost that would be associated with managing this. It also comes into where you may be able to offer less protections, which will cost you less money as well. So you need to consider that as a way to save you some money. Also, if you have this data classified into, let's just say, high and low, your high intellectual property or high sensitive data is stored in one location and you have disaster recovery and backup solutions in place for that information, well, now you're in a situation where you're paying good money for that. You have the backups in place. You have monitoring in place. You're paying a key premium for that capability, but then all this unstructured low data that's not considered highly sensitive by any means. So you now have that moved off in a different direction, and you don't have the same controls on that as you would your most sensitive information. Now, I say all of this to also put a cautionary note out there. Well, in a previous life, what we would do is we would take data that was be considered in many cases to be the unclassified, or the data that is really not useful. It's the unstructured, not classified data. And so what would end up happening is we would find out what this data is, and we would use key terms based off metadata. We would then filter all of that, and we would target specifically the unclassified or the unprotected data, the unstructured data. We would then suck all of that data out and then start working through it to figure out what was available. And what we would come to find is that many people would end up communicating utilizing these various forms, email, whatever it might be. But as they're doing that, they're actually adding in very highly sensitive information within these unstructured aspects, or these unprotected aspects. And then we would start building a picture based on that information, that unprotected, unclassified information. Over time, that becomes a bit of a challenge where you can then build the same kind of picture that you would whether that information was protected or not. Now, the thing is, you're not going to be able to stop that, and people are going to communicate. You can limit it substantially by having a good data classification program and by educating your employees to not communicate via these different mediums, and if they do, protect the information if they got to talk about anything that is sensitive in nature. Again, that's something you're going to have to trade off from a security professional standpoint. Is that something you can do? Is that something you can implement? But you're going to have to decide how that's going to all play out. It also plays into your disaster recovery solutions as well. We kind of talked about that a little bit with as you're moving your data from these more critical areas to a less critical area, which as it relates to unstructured data or unprotected data or unclassified data, you now can sit back and not have a disaster recovery type solution with it. You may not want to have a backup solution for this data potentially, depending upon the cost that's associated. If you are a smaller company and the cost of data storage is pretty small, but if you're running on a shoestring budget, you may decide that that's not something you want to pay for. So considering that as you're going on criticality and categorizing your data. Now, asset classification. You should match the data classification as much as possible when you're classifying this, okay? And you should look at this specifically about where you're putting your data and how you're going to actually put it together. Now, you need to have clear marking on these assets. So if you have a physical asset such as a computer, having a clear marking saying that this is do not utilize sensitive data on this machine, or this machine is not meant for anything that is of a high sensitivity. Putting those specific labels on the assets themselves is extremely important. Also, putting labels on the documents. So if you have documents that you're working on that are business confidential, you have a label or you have a header or a watermark on these documents saying they're business confidential. The purpose of that is to also get people in the right mindset to know that if you're going to be having this information and you're going to be utilizing it, you need to protect it. Well, how do you best protect it? You protect it when the individuals will have better labels on it. So if they have labels and they know that this is confidential, then they will, in many cases, will protect it to the level it needs to be. If they're just working on some random document that they don't know the classification of it, in many cases they won't put the level of protection that the document needs. So you need to consider that as you're looking at data classification. How do you label the information? How do you label the machines that it's working on? How do you label the software or the applications themselves? You can put a red banner across the top. Sometimes I've seen where people will log into their computers, and if it's a system is designed to be managing highly sensitive information, there'll be a red banner or a desktop slide will say highly sensitive information only. So those are different aspects you can utilize when you're talking about asset classification and marking your assets and labeling. You need to determine the data security controls also. We talked about that briefly earlier, but what controls are you going to put in place? And are you going to be potentially sharing this data with others? If you are, what kind of information do they need to have access to? Do they need to have a level that's remote capability where they can manage the documents remotely, or do they just need to be able to see them? Where do they need to be able to see them? Do they need to see them in a foreign country that may have challenges with intellectual property, that they're worried about data theft? Those are different aspects to consider. Always know that any information that is created will get shipped all over the globe. It's so easy now for that to occur. You can just might as well expect that that's going to happen. So if that's the case, and you don't want this data to be out to anybody, you need to make sure that you put key things in place to manage that and to watch that situation. Now, there's types of controls you can put in place specifically. Encryption, we talked about that briefly, is that as you got encryption, you have 256 AES encryption could be in place to wrap the data. There are applications in place that you could utilize that would wrap the data. So like say, for instance, if you're transferring information from here to Boston, you would want to have a secure connection between point A and point B. That would be protected. You also want to have an application that would potentially wrap the data that you have and put it in a protective coating to basically send it there as well, that only certain people that have the right access controls can access the information. And that kind of comes into the next point of access controls. Now, this could be through the application. It could be through the document itself. It could be through a SharePoint site where you're forcing people to go in and you have access controls on that SharePoint site. The other thing is that you have internal processes. So you have a thing in place where if the data is coming to Fred and Fred wants to open it, well, before Fred can open it, he has to get approval from Gina, and then Gina will allow Fred, to open the actual data. There could be internal processes around that. You could have it where it's got to have some level of approval where before the data is even sent, there is an approval around that as well. So those are processes that really need to come in play. The tools themselves can help you. There's a lot of protections that can be added. It's just the people part of it and the process aspect that you're going to have to implement as well. Also, you have physical controls in place. Do you limit users to access of the data by physical means? This could be a locked door, key card access, you name it. Those pieces could be in place as well. So you need to determine how, if you have to have a certain keypad to get into the data or the information, and it's in a locked room, how would you do that? Are those physical controls in place? Is that system that is available out in the open, available for anybody to use? Is it only in a supervisor's office and only those people have access to it? Is it on a remote location that you can just log in anywhere around the globe and get access to it? But to do that, you have to have the username and password, and you have to have a multi-factor PIN that's involved that forces the login capability. So there's different types of controls that you can put in. These are just a few that you could look at as you're looking to protect your information. Now, as we deal with data classification, here's some of the references that we went through just recently as it relates to data classification. The key thing to consider is that you need to come up with a plan to manage your data, and you need to start off small. Do not go complex. Keep this to a point where you are, if you have to, just go low and high, or go sensitive and unsensitive. Probably not the right word, not a sensitive person, but basically it's sensitive information or everything else is just business confidential, something like that. If it's sensitive information and it's personally identifiable information, then you need to look at who has access, how do they have access, what controls are in place, when do the people have to have access to it, and so on and so forth. Those are pieces that you're going to need to add together for a data classification strategy. And again, data classification, it's a fundamental piece of protecting your information. If you start small, you can do this. You really can. But you need to focus on keeping it simple. Don't go over complex. Start with just a few controls and a few people with access, and then work your way from there. But again, if your foundation is important, to start off with what you really want to try to accomplish as it relates to data classification. Okay, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. It's been a great opportunity for me to put this out there for you on data classification, and have a wonderful day. Also, make sure that you check me out at reducecyberrisk.com. I got some great stuff for you available out there at reducecyberrisk.com, and check us out there on the web. All right, have a great day. We'll talk to you later. See ya.